Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new Warframe guide. This time, we're going to be taking a look at the ins and outs of farming things efficiently within Warframe. We're going to be explaining how, why, and what are more efficient ways, although I would like to make a disclaimer, this is of course down to personal discretion, and this is merely a general overview of things that you can do within Warframe to improve your farming efficiency. If we went into all the finer points, we'd be here for 20 years, and we ain't got time for that. And of course, this is all down to our own opinion. There are other methods that could be used, and if I don't mention a method that you know, then leave a comment down below. I would love to know your opinions on methods that you use for farming and things that we may end up using later down the line. Now, initially, you would probably think farming in Warframe is rather straightforward. You go to a planet with the resources you want, and you just do the thing, and you get resources in the process. And for the most part, you'd be right to say that, except there are a bunch of ways within Warframe that allow you to exponentially boost your income of loot and resources. For most players, as they progress through the star chart, you will naturally run across materials you need and start making up a bank. But whether it be when you've completed the star chart, and you want to start blasting up that mastery and suddenly start making crap ton of frames and weapons, which leaves your bank empty, or whether you go to build that one thing and realize, wait a minute, I don't have those blank. At some point, we've all gone through the damn, I wish I could get those things quicker moment. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what this guide is going to be all about. We're going to take a look at frames, mechanisms of the frames themselves that will allow you to farm efficiently and improve that overall loot income, as well as hints and tips as to where certain resources are from, specifically gimmicks and methods in which of getting those materials would be more efficient. So let's start with a couple little tidbits, shall we? All resources that are used for crafting can be affected by duplication, which is the act of receiving bonus resources or duplicating said resources with a frame's abilities. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that this does not apply to endo or mods, as they are a separate category of item entirely that does not benefit from these mechanics. So just to get that out of the way before any of the comments become awash with, "But Makari, it didn't work on my endo farm." Because it just doesn't, that's why. Seeing as we mentioned it a moment ago, let's cover what boosters are. I've mentioned these in a few videos before, but boosters are an incredible avenue for you to get into a much more profound way of farming. They are by no means mandatory, but they're an option should you have some spare platinum lying around. Within the marketplace, within Warframe, if you go to the equipments tab and go to boosters, these things offer you an avenue of increasing your loot income. You have the resource booster, the drop chance booster, the credit booster, and the affinity booster. All very self-explanatory what they boost. You would want, if you are going to use these, you're going to essentially want to combine the resource booster with the drop chance booster to really push those resources through the roof. Okay, so the best place to start with getting these resources to drop faster is to ask the question, what is going to be the best frame to run, as there are a few frames that have specific abilities or augments that can benefit you in any run you go on in terms of loot duplication or additional loot dropping. Necros is one of the first frames we're going to take a look at, and is probably one of the most prevalent in the farming scene for frames. Necros has an ability called Desecrate. This is an aura that he generates around his body with a 25-meter radius. In short, this will cause dead bodies and body parts to have a 54% chance to roll their loot table again. So the way to look at this in layman's terms is, when an enemy dies, they have the chance to drop items from their loot table again. Desecration merely allows this loot duplication to happen more than once to anything that is dead and affected by the desecration. And because this is affected primarily by range, and seeing as you generally don't need power strength with Necros in the first place, a full range build will encompass most of the map you're in at that given time. Unfortunately, this is not affected by power strength, so you are left with that flat 54%, but because the entire purpose of the game revolves around enemies dying, and as bodies get cut up into small pieces, you're going to have a lot to desecrate and a lot of chances of re-rolling those loot drops. Now, you may have noticed I mentioned something about body parts. Now, this is because when a body breaks into a chunk, or the chunk of the enemy body parts that are present in the map, each of these body parts can be affected by a desecration. Now, in order to cause a body to break into multiple chunks, you'll need slash damage. Enemies do just naturally disintegrate into smaller pieces as you blow them away anyway. However, slash damage almost guarantees a chunk of the enemy will be split into 2 or 3 or up to 4 times. This will allow Necros' Desecration to proc more efficiently, allowing for multiple instances of loot duplication. If I could recommend specific frames, Equinox is ideal for this as his maim is entirely slash-based, but we'll cover this a bit more later. Necros also has an augment for this ability called Despoil, which allows you to consume health rather than energy to desecrate. Enemies are then also dropping additional health orbs, which means you're not as likely to run out of health, which means you can have this desecration running almost indefinitely, assuming you're walking around actually picking up these health orbs. It is also just something that will make life much easier, and then you can combine that with Equilibrium as well, which generates additional health and energy whenever you pick up a health or energy orb. Hydroid is one of the next frames to look at in terms of frames with loot duplication abilities. Hydroid's Tentacle Swarm, which is his 4, it has an augment called Pilfering Swarm, which will cause enemies held by the tentacles to drop additional loot once killed. And this stacks with other loot duplication abilities, like Desecration for example, and is very heavily based on range and duration. You would want to build this based on the map you're playing on, so know the tile set you're going to, build the range based on what you go on, bearing in mind the smaller range you build, the more condensed the tentacles will be, but for more open areas, you're probably going to want to cover those areas with those tentacles. Just realize this is down to personal preference, and Hydroid is always a good frame to have in these loot duplication setups. In fact, he is one of the staples, I would say. Atlas is one of the next frames that has the ability of helping with loot duplication. He has an ability called Petrify, which has an augment called Orgaze. This will cause petrified enemies to have a 25% chance to drop additional loot when killed. But this has a better chance of proccing loot duplication with more power strength. So you would want to build power strength to increase the chance, range to increase the area affected, and maybe a smidge of duration just to make sure they're petrified for longer, giving you more chance to kill them. But, you know, efficiency then helps you cast it more, and it's a thing where you just need to realize how he builds with this. But making sure this is placed on top of your other abilities with Desecration, Tentacle Swarm, so forth, so on, will help greatly. Korra is the final mention here. Korra is one of the latest frames to get a loot duplication augment, which is called Pilfering Strangledome. Not the most creative of names, I'll admit, but still. This gives enemies held by the Strangledome a 65% chance of dropping additional loot. However, this is not affected by power strength like some of the other abilities. This is just a flat percentage chance to drop loot, and building a bigger Strangledome is probably the only way you're going to make this slightly more effective. This will then synergize again with Necros' Desecration, Hydroid's Pilfering Swarm, or even Atlas's Orgaze. These 4 frames that we have mentioned are the 4 main frames I would recommend putting into a team to help duplicate loot. There are some other frames like Ivara that can give some extra loot here or there, but these are the ones that do it most consistently without having to just sit there waiting for frames to pick pockets or exponentially just wait for abilities to cast. These are definitely the 4 that you would want to prioritize for loot duplication. An honorable mention does have to go here as well to the mods called Vacuum and Fetch, which are for the respective loads of your companion for the Kubro and Kavat, and then subsequently for your Death Cube as well. These mods allow for resources to be sucked from further distances away, meaning you don't have to be so attentive to picking up all the individual little bits around you. Smeety Kavats also get a mod called Charm, which has a chance to either double resources acquired or dispense 1 rare resource of the planet you're on, which is super good and can greatly increase the potency of your farming and is pretty much a must if you're really min-maxing your farming runs. So when it comes to which frames to use, a good base is to start with a Necros. Necros is like the bread to butter. You have to have something to base your farming on, and Necros is generally that choice. Keeping in mind, having multiple Necroses isn't a bad thing, and will allow you to cover a wider area of influence. But generally Necros is the base, and then any combination of the other frames will work wonders. My personal recommendation would be to bring an Equinox as well, as the guaranteed slash procs from the maim, and seeing as it's based purely on your range, will allow you to overlap quite nicely with Desecration, slash procking everything, causing them to chunk up into smaller pieces, allowing Desecration to desecrate more. My personal ideal composition for farming, which I could recommend, is 1 or 2 Necroses based on the map you're playing on, then a Hydroid with a medium range build, or again changed based on what your map you're playing on, with Pilfering Swarm. Then for higher density maps, I'll bring a Vauban to suck in enemies and combine that with an Atlas and Orgaze to petrify the clumped up enemies that Vauban will suck in. One honourable mention as well should definitely go to the extractors. They're by no means anything you should use all the time, and they're probably not something you'll really worry about once you've really gotten into farming efficiently, but they're a nice little thing you can use when you may not be able to dedicate much time to the game as other people. Extractors are a thing you can craft. They are an item that you can place on the extractor node of every map you have completely unlocked. This in turn will allow you to farm resources whilst offline. They basically go about their, you place them on the map, or on the extractor node, sorry, and then they will start earning you resources whilst you're offline or whilst you're just casually doing things, and then you come back to them later once they finished extracting, and they will have earned you a certain amount of resources from that planet. Bear in mind that there are more efficient extractors, and the more efficient extractor you use, the better resources you get and more likelihood of the rarer materials you'll get as well. However, again, once you get to the later stages, you might not rely on these quite as much. Now we're going to take a closer look at the resources themselves, because this is where some of the interesting elements comes in. We are quickly going to gloss over the common resources, as these are things that you will get as you play, but I feel as it's worth at least mentioning them and giving some advice for the best farm locations. Keeping in mind, of course, generally higher level missions will drop them in more frequent quantities, but that would be down to you to decide on what level you're willing to go in at. Alloy plates, ferrite, nanospores, polymer bundles, and salvage are all common and will drop in large quantities from any mission you're in. Circuits, plastids, and rubido and oxium are all considered uncommon and will drop in a complementary fashion to the common items from the mission you're in as well. These are the resources that you're more likely to struggle on as they drop in smaller quantities and less frequent, and you're very likely going to have a couple of stages in your time playing Warframe where you're like, oh no, I'm out of this resource, where will I farm this? There is a resource we need to mention here as well, which is called cryotic. It's technically a common resource, but because it only drops in a very specific manner, it kind of falls out of the category of any, because it's basically farmed from doing excavation missions. For this, the easiest way would be to do excavations on Earth or Mars, so you can effectively have multiple extra excavators up at any given time, without them dying, seeing as the excavators don't scale based so much on the level as they do the tier of mission you're doing. So starting with a lower tier excavation and then having multiple up will mean you farm more cryotic. Bearing in mind the amount of cryotic you get is based on the completion of each excavator active. Now for the rare resources, and with this I will be explaining the resources' most common drop areas rather than just listing off the planet they spawn on, as there's a lot of crossover when it comes to farming one resource, as farming one resource will more than likely allow you to earn other types of resources in the process, and that vicariously allows you to get other resources and other rarer resources at the same times. If we explained each individual one on their own, we'd be here for 5 years and we don't have time for that. Starting this rare list off, we will start with the most annoying resource to farm for, Argon Crystals. These are dropped solely from the Void and can appear as nodes within the Void mission itself, which can be broken for 1 or 2 crystals apiece. As a side note, control modules also drop from here very frequently, although they also drop in other places like Europa, for example, but this would probably be the best place to farm them as you can get them in conjunction with the Argon Crystals. My recommendation would be to either do Tyrannus or Annie, as both of these have large amounts of enemies spawning at any given time that are in a condensed, closed, small area for the efficient use of desecration and your other farming abilities. As a very big word of warning, Argon Crystals have a half-life. Every day, the amount of Argon Crystals you have will be halved. Dick move, right? So keep an eye on how many you have, because the last thing you want is being all like, oh yeah, I've got plenty, and then being like, oh wait, what the shit happened to my Argon Crystals? Morphix and Gallium are a fun farm indeed. They both drop on Mars, and this would be my recommendation in terms of being able to farm both of them at the same time. However, Gallium does have a tendency of dropping from Uranus more frequently, however. It is one of those resources that has a tendency of being harder to come across. If you're planning on farming gallium, these are my recommendations. The first one being Augustus, as it is a very high density mission on Mars with an excavation map as well. This map will have lots of enemies in a close quarter that will naturally beeline for your location, allowing for easy farming methods, and also has good rewards from the excavators as well, especially if you're planning on getting other things aside from just the resources. But if it is just gallium, however, that you're after, then my recommendation would be to either do the assassination on Uranus, which is Tal'Rai Gore, or go and do the Ophelia mission, which is a survival, which has a lot of narrow corridors, which allows you to bottleneck and siphon enemies your way, allowing for efficient farming. And now for neurodes. These are a lovely resource that can be passively obtained from Earth, but my recommendation would be to go to Akkad on Eris, as this is a Dark Sector mission, which I'll explain more about in a moment, but it's a small, condensed defense mission, which also conveniently gives a lot of nanospores, plastids, and some other stuff as well, and it's good for XP, but this is definitely one of the more consistent ways of farming neurodes. You can also farm the assassination on the Arkan Derelict as well, which is Lephantis. That guarantees almost at least one per run, but it's one of the more common, rarer resources, so I wouldn't say going out of your way to farm assassinations would be the most optimal way of farming this. Neural sensors. These are probably one of the more annoying resources to farm for, but these will casually drop from Jupiter and the Kuva Fortress. However, my recommendation would be to get a group together and spam run Alad V assassination on Jupiter, as you can generally blast through this mission in a very short space of time, and have Alad V give you a much higher chance of dropping one or two of these, as assassination targets tend to have a much higher chance of the rarer material. Doing a regular farming run is definitely not a bad idea either. You can go to Io, you could go to the survival in the Kuva Fortress, but seeing as it's just generally quicker to run an Alad V mission and just blast him down and hope the one drops, there's no consistent way, as with most of these resources. It's just about working with what you know and what would work best for you. So my recommendation, Alad V, or Io, or Tavaluni on Kuva Fortress, depending on what you want to go for. Orokin cells, oh Orokin cells, that's one resource we never seem to have quite enough of. Honestly, there isn't much to really explain here. We all know how valuable these little things are and how little they drop. Honestly, there are only two recommendations here, with either going to Saturn and using Helene, which is a super small condensed defense mission with lots of passive breakable nodes, or go to the Derelict and do the defense or survival mission there, as that has a high drop chance for them too, which will alternatively also allow you to farm for nanospores, mutagen samples, and a bunch of other things. With either of these methods, you'll want to bring a good farming setup, however. And finally, the weirdest item on our list, and possibly the most inconsistent item, Tellurium. Technically, this is only meant to spawn in Arkwing missions, but because certain maps like Uranus and Kuva Fortress start you out in Arkwing or have Arkwing segments to them, these maps actually drop Tellurium in their ground missions as well. I find either farming Kuva on Tavaluni will get you a lot of these. In the process of doing the same farming method for Gallium on Ophelia, this will also be the best way of farming Tellurium as well on Uranus. Alas, it is just one of those resources that will be annoyingly frustrating to farm for and cause you to tear out your hair slightly. So be clever with where you farm, as you can just get them from general Arkwing missions as well, but use the Arkwing enabled maps as well to help you farm them. There's a separate category of materials called research materials, which are specifically for your clan dojo research and constructing the items therein. The first of these items are called mutagen samples. These have a heightened drop chance from spawning in the Arkan Derelict, so my recommendation would be to go to the Arkan Derelict defense or survival to farm these in their hundreds. Or, if that is not an option as you need to go there with a pre-set up group, then go to Eris and farm Akkad. This will not only get you other things like neurodes, polymer bundles, nanospores, but it's a good place for XP in general. Detonite ampules and Fieldron are then the counterpart for their respective dojo research, Fieldron being generally best farmed from Jupiter, either on Fortuna as a bounty reward, or farming going to Io and farming there instead, as Io is a great farming map for most resources you would want from this sort of tile set. Detonite ampules are best obtained from Uranus or Earth, as these are two planets that you'll be spending a lot of time on anyway, and will just casually drop them as you go through. Much like any other resource, these three can also be obtained as nodes within the maps as well, and are something you will need a lot of. These are also reflective of the dojo, part of the dojo they're from. For example, Fieldron is from the Corpus segment, Detonite Ampules are from the Grineer segment, and the Mutant Samples are from the Infested segment. When it comes to farming in general, it's best to take into consideration the type of map you'll be playing on. Maps that have infinite rotations like excavation, survival, and defense missions will generally offer the best and most consistent source of income, as they will give you a consistent stream of enemies and often have the highest amount of enemies that will be active at any given time. Unlike extermination missions, spy missions, where the enemies just wait for you to come to them. Not to mention, because of the AI, which, let's face it, is not that clever in Warframe, the enemies will be forced to beeline towards you. You can then choose to hold down a location and let the farming commence, which then leads to another little tidbit, which is the tile set itself. A lot of tile sets, which is basically the type of map you're on, will have segments to them which allows for enemies to be bottlenecked and farmed efficiently. So let them come to you, use the map to your advantage, and let that allow your farming to be easier. For example, whenever I want to farm polymer bundles, I go to Ophelia, find a nice little corner with the biggest areas connected to it, so that there will be more enemies spawning in those bigger areas, and then they will beeline towards us using the doors to travel through, which bottlenecks them. We then collectively allow them to bottle up, use our abilities to cause them to drop extra loot, and essentially turn into a meat grinder, where they all end up dying and then get affected by the loot duplication. And last but not least, to tie all this off, I want to share my favourite locations for farming. When it comes to farming in general or solo, it's worth keeping an eye on the type of mission you're doing. There are missions called Dark Sector missions, which every planet has a couple of. These missions allow you to earn extra revenue, as well as also extra resources and XP, so keep an eye out for the Dark Sector missions to help improve your overall resource income. For Gallium, Plastids, Detonite Ampules, Polymer Bundles, and Tellurium, it's already been mentioned, but Ophelia is a great location. It houses some big rooms which allow for large amounts of enemies to spawn, tight corners to line of sight enemies to get close, which can then make your farming much more efficient. You also get condition overload from the Drakkar Butchers, which is also a very nice little added benefit, as this can be an added bit of a platinum income whilst you're farming resources. Although if you want something a bit more casual and something a bit more laid back, Assure, which is an infested mission, this means that you are able to allow enemies to come to you much quicker, but it's also one that doesn't require as much attention and can be used as sort of a solo farm should you wish, and an added option if you're tired of dealing with Grineer. For Nanospores, Mutant Samples, Orkin Cells, and Neurodes, Orkin Derelict defense and survival are phenomenal as mentioned previously. The Orkin Derelict has a heightened chance of mutant samples, and by that I mean a lot of a heightened chance. And with how many enemies spawn, as well as how quickly you can burn through waves on these maps, this offers some very consistent avenues for farming. The only downside is you'll need a preordained group to do this, but if that's not on the table, then Akkad on Eris will be a good opportunity to farm these same resources as well. And last but not least, Oxium. Fuck Oxium. Just kidding! Oxium's alright, just a bit annoying as it drops in such small quantities and will only drop from ospreys. Right now, the only place I'd really recommend trying to actually attempt to farm this material would be Io on Jupiter, as it's a low-level mission, can be farmed quickly, and there's a decent amount of ospreys that will spawn at any given time. But really, this is just something that you get as you play through Corpus tile sets. If you really want to focus farming it, just keep doing Corpus missions and you will just casually build up Oxium as you go. And that's the video, lads. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you have comments about things you would like to see in future videos, then do leave a comment in the comment segment down below. And if there's methods of farming or things that you can suggest for farming as well, then by all means, leave a comment down below as well. We would love to hear your opinions. Of course, there's things that we've missed out of this, as there would be with any guide. This is obviously just based down on a personal opinion and things that you can use to better your experience of farming within Warframe. So thank you very much for watching, guys. Leave a like, share the video, maybe subscribe, and if you want the glyph, you can use the code Makarimorph to obtain the glyph as well. So I'll see all you top adders in the next episode. Ta-ra!